This is Clark the Knife with a quick review here of an underrated set of aftermarket scales for the Benchmade Bugout. These are the aluminum scales with micarta inlays from Alan Putman, also known as Putman Scales, also known as bladescales.com. Not going to do my full, tip to tail specs, all that sort of stuff. This is just the review of just the set of scales and sort of talking about how I like the knife differently with the scales compared to your original stock Bugout here. And I think that these, Putman scales used to be a bit more popular than they are these days, or at least used to be talked about a little bit more. But I think they are still a really good option, especially given the price that they are charging. So let's talk a little bit about why. So these are made in the USA, CNC machined aftermarket scales for the Benchmade Bugout. In this particular version, Putman was probably best known for his G10 scales that had kind of like an onso textured pattern. It had that sort of jagged rock pattern all the way over them. That's what he sort of was most well known for, but he's also made a lot of scales in aluminum. He made some for the Griptilian, he's made some for the Hogue Deca, and he makes these for the Bugout. And these are in stock as of the time this video is being recorded. So these scales have an aluminum frame. This is black, basically sort of a hard anodized, got a chalky texture like a Pro-Tech sort of thing. Aluminum with a micarta inlay screwed in right there. This is still very much a Bugout. This is one of those Ranger green or sort of OD green Bugouts with the gold stud here. And these scales are $45. That makes them significantly cheaper than any other aftermarket scales that I'm aware of that are made in the USA. And frankly, cheaper than any Bugout scales that I'm aware of, except for maybe Aimfront, that are made of aluminum or any metal whatsoever. And there's a lot to like about these scales. First, let's just look up close. Again, a nice black color, not a jet black. You can see it's a bit of almost sort of a wash black. Pretty even chamfer all the way around the edge. It does vary a little bit. There's a little bit of a smaller chamfer right behind the axis lock. Gets a little wider toward the back. Then you've got a little extra chamfer right there. When you go inside, you can see the portion behind the micarta is actually milled out entirely. So there's no aluminum there. There's just micarta. You can feel a tiny bit of flex, but frankly, it's captive in the sort of aluminum around here, and then it's got the screws where those screws are anchored into aluminum at those 2 points. So frankly, you'd have to try really hard to punch a hole through that micarta. Micarta, it's not as stiff as G10 or something, or not as stiff as metal, but it's still plenty stiff. But what that does, and if you look closer, you can see it's also milled out. You need the space for all the stuff that houses the axis lock, but it's also milled out all around that axis lock there. Basically, all the space from this part of the knife back that can be milled out is milled out in these scales. And as a result, these are aluminum scales that add a lot of stiffness and add a sort of different grip feel to the Bugout while not adding all that much weight. Let me see here. I do have a scale here, and so if I compare, if we go to our scales, sorry for the big halo there, but if we compare, let me zero this, there we go, your stock Bugout comes in at, my scale is not working, ounces. Okay. Yeah. Oh well, better in theory than in practice. The fact is, while my scale isn't working, I can tell you that this aluminum Bugout here is not that much heavier than this FRN Bugout. It definitely feels, it's definitely heavier, but honestly, it's almost certainly less than, it feels like maybe an ounce heavier, maybe even less than an ounce heavier. What are you getting in exchange for $45, which is not that much, and maybe an extra ounce of carry? First off, you're getting a slightly different profile. It is a little bit thicker. It's also, these are flat scales rather than the rounded off scales in the stock Bugout. So in the hand, this feels a little bit blockier. It also feels a little bit chalkier. The surface texture has a little bit more grip. The Bugout actually feels very nice with a blockier frame on the top and bottom, because this big flat toward the bottom here actually gives you a really nice secure grip in this primary grip here. These little chamfers make it nice enough for your finger to get around, and it's not harsh at all. But it does feel a little bit more secure to post your fingers there, and it feels like you can push this knife a little harder. On top of that, because it's aluminum, there's not really, you can flex if you really, really try, but if you're the sort of person that doesn't like how much these Grippery or FRN scales can flex, you get a much stiffer, much more robust feeling knife with these aluminum scales. And you get it without thickening the knife all that much. You get it without making the knife all that much heavier. And you get it in a design, you know, this is aluminum with an inlay. It's just a cooler looking design. It's a more interesting design, especially as this micarta starts to wear in. And frankly, with these scales, you end up with a Bugout that still very much looks and feels like a Bugout. This isn't a radical departure from the shape of the Bugout like, say, AWT's Archon scales. And it also doesn't make it feel sort of slick like Aimfront scales or anything like that does. It's not trying to change what the Bugout is. This still looks and feels very much like a sort of utilitarian, a slim, lightweight, nice, easy to carry utilitarian knife. But you just get a knife that feels a little more robust, a little more premium. And of course, as is the case with many aftermarket scales, you also get, of course, I have it tuned way too tight now, but when I get it tuned properly, you get a smoother action. I've got it tight right now, but what you will get with these Putman scales, for the same reason I said with the Flightanium scales, is you get more of a smoother action, and if I were to loosen this pivot a little bit, you can get a consistent sort of drop shutty, free droppy action without any play more easily with metal scales like this than you can with, say, your stock Benchmade scales. Again, with Benchmade, that is less of an issue than it used to be. You know, this is a relatively recent, this is their sort of smoke colorway from a year ago. And this now has nice, consistent, droppy action without any play. It works quite nicely. But especially if you've got an older Bugout, often upgrading to aftermarket scales like this can improve that action materially. Either get it so that you can get a bit of a smoother action, or get it so that you can get that drop shutty action without play. And that's been my experience here. So the fact is, these scales are pretty simple. It's pretty easy to understand what they are. They are nicely made without being exquisitely made. You know, your tolerances aren't super tight here. They're not really trying to be. Again, your chamfers are mostly even, but there's a couple places here where they get a little squirrely. It's got the same overall profile as the Bugout, but it's not like these are, you know, a masterwork of machining anywhere, and I don't think they're trying to be. What they're trying to be instead are surprisingly affordable, very nicely made scales that keep the Bugout feeling like the Bugout, while just making it a little bit better, a little bit stiffer, feeling like it's a little bit more robust, and maybe with a little bit better action when you tune it. These aren't as sweet or as cool as something like the Flightanium scales I looked at, but again, to do the same sort of comparison I talked about with the Flightanium scales, if you told me at table, like on the table, which feels like a more premium knife or which feels more suitable for the price, this knife for $180 versus this knife for $225, I do think that a lot of people would think that given, when people complain about the bug out, they often complain about it feeling, if anything, a little too light, or the plastic handles feeling cheap or chintzy or bending, or the play or anything like that. You're paying $45 here, so you're going from $180 to $225 to get a set of scales that quite affordably improves, if not outright resolves, most of those issues. And so part of the reason why I made this video is I do see this particular set of scales talked about a lot less than a lot of the other common ones, than Rock Scale and Flytanium and Rips Garage Tech or RC Blade Works, all those sorts of things, Applied Weapons Tech. And all those companies make fantastic scales. And I've got a lot of their scales on other knives right now. But I do think that these blade scales, again, bladescales.com, these Putman scales, should be seriously looked at by a lot of people that just want to make their bug out a little bit better and want to be able to do it as affordably as possible. And I do think there's probably a pretty big audience for that. So anyway, not a big review, not a complicated review, just wanted to give some quick thoughts on this pretty cool set of scales. And by the way, I've been buying Putman scales for a few years now, and they've been quite consistent with their quality. Every set that I've gotten has fit onto whatever knife it was, whether it was a 940 or a Griptilian or a Bugout or even a Spyderco. They've all been quite consistent, they've all fit quite well, and they've all been relatively easy to take on and off. As easy as taking scales on and off a Bugout is, which is always a bit of a pain in the ass. But if you're willing to do that, seriously give these scales a look. I do think that they will make your Bugout better and might be one of the most affordable and overall best value ways to do that on the market right now. That's it. Hope you found this informative, or at least a little bit entertaining. And most of all, I hope you found it to be a good use of your time. This has been Clark the Knife. I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.